Hello, join me as we make 2 Yeast-Risen Prosphora. Traditionally, a sourdough starter is used as the leaven, but we'll be using dry yeast granules. These are the 2 prosphora made during this video. All the proportions and measurements can be found at prospero.com. Here's a list of the ingredients for today. Hand-carved holy wooden prosphora seals make the best impression. They come in different sizes with different motifs around a cross. The website gives more information. Let's get started. Always measure everything accurately with electronic scales to the gram if possible. So today we're using 1200 grams of flour for 2 600-gram prosphora. The right amount of salt is 1/100th the weight of the flour, so 12 grams today. Mix the salt through the flour. Now, because yeast rises the dough very quickly, we need only 1/4 teaspoon of dry yeast granules for each prosphora. This is a key factor in preventing the loss of the seal's impression. Using such a small amount of yeast causes a less rapid and more controlled rise of the dough. There's no need to dissolve the yeast granules. I've tried, it makes no difference. Just mix well into the flour. And since there's no Christianity without the cross, we make the sign of the cross wherever possible. We need a low hydration dough for prosphora, in fact 50% hydration, so half the weight of the flour is how many mils of water we use. 1200 grams of flour needs 600 mils of spring water. A quick look at my setup: watch and ring off, prayers handy, vigil light and icons of God and His Mother, the seal, rolling pin, pans, and the water and flour all measured and ready to go. It is said that the Divine Liturgy actually begins in the home of people as they set out to make prosphora. Since we're participating in such an awesome event, everything should be done prayerfully and mindfully. We Orthodox Christians, making the holy bread offering, pray and sense our home, kitchen, the utensils, the ingredients. The prayers and incense purify everything, and they rise as a sweet-smelling gift to God. So we sense literally everything. There are set Orthodox prayers for the preparation of prosphora, and you can find the ones I use at prospero.com. Let's jump right in. Pour the water into the dry ingredients, making the sign of the cross. We also love doing things 3 times for obvious reasons. I like to hold back about 20 mils of water. Different humidity levels and variations in the batches of flour may call for a little less water to get the dough just right. So I hold back the 20 mils because it's easier to add a little water if the dough's too dry than to have to add flour to a dough that's too wet and sticky. Stir the water through the flour. Use movements that lift the ingredients from the bottom as you turn the bowl. Within a minute or 2, the mixture looks raggedy. It's important to incorporate all the flour into the dough, making sure to not leave any lumps or flakes of dry ingredients. These can cause imperfections on the surface, and they bake into hard irregularities, which are really not ideal for our purposes. Within a couple of minutes, our mixture has taken up all the ingredients and has become, at this early stage, a rough, firm dough. It needs to rest. In order to let the water act on the sugars and proteins, we give it a period of rest, and this rest phase we call autolysis. To prevent the surface of the dough from drying out during autolysis, we cover it with a damp tea towel. We dust the pans with flour. Notice I'm preparing a pan that's 1 size smaller than the pans we'll use to bake. This is the shaping pan. It receives a more generous dusting of flour on both the sides and the base. The other pans get a light dusting only on their bases. After 15 minutes of rest, the dough is softer and smoother. We need to cut the dough into 2 equal parts. Consistency is important in baking. If every time we bake we have unintended differences, our results will always be hit and miss. As we embark on this holy work, it's recommended that until we gain experience, we use the same weight of dough for each Prospero every time we bake. Then, after even a short time, we'll be more confident about many of the key things, like assessing the maturity of the dough, and importantly, then, if we decide to experiment with a particular variation, we'll have a better idea of its effects. We knead one lump of dough for about a minute and then alternate with the other so they don't dry out. Our dough is becoming smoother as we knead, but because it's a low hydration dough, the folds remain intact despite all the moulding and pressure. A wetter dough won't hold its shape like this. The dough needs to rest before the next stage, and for convenience I use plastic freezer bags. We can also rest the dough under a damp tea towel. During the periods of kneading and resting, a bread dough experiences many complex chemical changes. The water in the dough continues to act on the sugars and proteins of the flour. The physical forces delivered by the kneading cause the strands of gluten, which is the flour's protein, to be realigned into a matrix and to become strengthened, more elastic, and reinforced. We can notice the change in the feel of the dough. At the same time, the yeast is beginning to ferment and small bubbles of gas are being produced. This is yet another reason why it's best to avoid using a large amount of yeast, more than what I've recommended. It's much better to have less fermentation at this early stage to afford us enough time for the proper moulding and shaping of the dough, well before it becomes very aerated and bubbly. Now, you might ask, is all this tiresome rolling and folding really necessary? You can choose to just knead it by hand for another 7 to 10 minutes, and you'll probably produce good results. However, what we found is that the rolling and folding really benefits our Prospero in a number of important ways. Firstly, it pops many of the air bubbles which might otherwise remain and swell with the rise and damage the surface. Secondly, the rolling is a really very efficient type of kneading, particularly effective for the strengthening and reinforcement of the gluten matrix. This helps the dough keep its shape as it rises. Thirdly, and very importantly, the folding and rolling creates a tighter, more uniform crumb in the bread with less chance of irregular air bubbles and cavities forming. While it's nice to have large holes in our dinner bread, it's the last thing the priest needs when he's preparing the lamb. A hole or cavity right under the seal will make the Prospero unacceptable for the altar. It can then only be used as andidoron. Throughout the rolling and folding, if you look carefully, you'll notice I protect and favour one side of the dough, preparing this side to become the top surface of the Prospero. All this shaping and rolling then leads beautifully onto the next stage, the shaping of our Prospero. Here we are at the last of the folds, especially mindful of the quality of the surface which will become the top of the Prospero. After a light spray of water to bind the dough internally, we roll up the dough and prepare to shape it into, hopefully, a perfect smooth disc. If we want our Prospero to look beautiful, we must do a good job of shaping and smoothing the dough. Now, the aim of this part of the process is to produce a disc of dough which is perfectly round and of uniform thickness. Why is this important? Because if the disc is not round and uniform in thickness, when we stamp it, the result will be a lopsided Prospero, bulging on one side and thin on the other. It should also have a very silky smooth surface, especially on the top side where the stamp will go. If the surface is not smooth at this stage, any imperfections will become amplified during the rise and they'll appear as defects. You can see how I'm being careful to preserve the top side of the dough. Notice how my hands work to keep the smooth side cradled safely in my palm, while with my other hand I gather up all the rough ends, pressing them together and dragging them towards what will become the base of the Prospero. You see, I repeatedly squeeze together the folds on that side of the dough in order to avoid clefts in the body of the Prospero. A tiny spray of water in the folds will help to ensure that these folds bind together. For obvious reasons, this technique is called making a pear. When the dough of your pear feels like one cohesive mass, it's time to shape the dough into a disc, and the best way to do this is to press it into a mold with the ideal shape and dimensions. And you'll recall we've already prepared that slightly smaller shaping pan in readiness. Remember, we had dusted this mold with flour on its base as well as on its sides to prevent sticking. We don't want to shape the dough in this mold and then have to prise it out of shape to remove it. I like to drag the sides of the dough towards the center of the base and compress it there. Check that the dough is not lopsided and then drop it out of the mold. Now we need to work on its surface. We smooth the surface of the dough, both the top and the sides, using our hands and maybe also a soft brush. Brush away any loose flour and rub the dough repeatedly with the palm of your hand until it becomes silky smooth. Be careful to preserve its round shape and its uniform thickness. The smoother and more perfectly round your disc of dough, the better your chances of producing a beautiful Prospero. To make the sides of the Prospero smooth like the top, it helps to gently drag down the top surface towards the base. When it's ready, it goes into the exact center of the baking pan. Now you see why we choose a smaller pan to mold and shape the disc. It should easily slip into the baking pan with a gap around the edges between the dough and the pan. Make sure this gap is the same all around, and then your dough is ready for the rise. It should be covered with a damp tea towel to prevent the surface drying out. And let's not forget to dust the molding pan ready for the next Prospero. Let's speed things up to save time. So-called sacraments, known as the mysteries in our church, are cosmic, or rather, as Orthodox Christians, we understand our whole lives and the entire cosmos as mystery. Christ said, "I am the bread of life, of which if any person eat, they shall never hunger." The value of our gift of a loaf of bread is much greater than the value of the ingredients and the effort to prepare it. Our offering represents our appreciation for everything. In effect, we take God's material gifts to us, the wheat, the water, the grapes. We prepare them with love and offer the leavened bread and fermented wine back to God. He accepts them and gifts them back to us as his pure body and precious blood, assuring us that whoever eats his flesh and drinks his blood abides in him and he in us. The mystery of the Eucharist is awesome. Since we're dealing with holy things, we prepare them with prayer and gratitude, and we try to always offer our best, the best ingredients, in the cleanest kitchen, and only after having washed ourselves both physically and through regular confession. It's incredibly edifying, and I urge you to have a go. So that we can get the very best and deepest impression of the seal, we must give the dough a 15-minute rest before stamping. This allows the dough to become soft. It should not stick to your seal because of its low hydration. So now your disc of dough has been resting, softening under a damp tea towel in the very center of the pan. The holy wooden seal bears the shape of a cross and has different motifs representing different things, all of which I've explained on the website. To avoid a wonky Prospero, we place the seal exactly in the middle of the pan. Get up a little higher, maybe on a short stool, and use your weight to press the seal deeply into the dough. Turn the pan often to ensure a more even pressure. Keep pressing until the top of the seal becomes level with the dough around the edges. To remove the seal, gently pull upwards a little at a time, turning regularly. Protect the surface once you're done from drying out by either a damp tea towel or an elasticized plastic cover. I'm going to use a smaller seal for the second Prospero. The first seal was 15.5 centimeters. This one is 14.5 centimeters. It's surprising how differently the dough rises depending on the seal diameter. If your wooden seal is too small, say almost half the diameter of the pan, then as the dough rises, paradoxically, instead of the impression growing, the sides of expanding dough will shrink the seal's impression even more. All the statistics, like pan sizes to weight of flour to seal diameter, all this information can be found tabled on my website, prospero.com. The piercing of the Prospero is not strictly speaking essential. It's done in order to allow the escape of expanding gases which can give rise to cavities and defects. But it's very important that we never pierce certain places, especially the central area called the Lamb of God. I am piercing in what's known to be the traditionally accepted points. The 12 piercings are made with prayers. On my website, I link to a short video that includes these prayers if you're interested. The little crosses at the 12, 3, 6, and 9 o'clock positions are not essential. They're just embellishments. As the dough rises, these little crosses will travel outwards towards the sides of the Prospero. For the rise, our pan should be covered to prevent drying and should rest on timber, not a cold stone or metal slab. Our dough has matured and is ready to bake about when it has doubled its height, and the impression of the seal has risen a little above the surrounding dough. The time to the maturation of the dough varies depending on many factors, but especially the ambient temperature. Experience will teach you these important things. I bake at 185 degrees Celsius on the fan-forced setting, starting from cold. At about the 4 and the 8 minute marks, I check the surfaces of the Prospero and pierce any air bubbles which may have developed in the heat. Then I use my soft brush to gently reshape the dough. We don't want hard brown crusts, so we cover the pans with aluminium at about the 15-minute mark and leave them covered for the rest of the bake, which in my oven takes about 55 minutes in total. Here are the Prospero baked to a lovely honey color. You can brush some boiling hot water over the surface if you want to impart a sheen, but that's not essential. Glazing and steam glazing are covered in the website. It's always a thrill, a delightful pair of Prospero, free of any blemishes. These should be acceptable for the holy altar. Glory to God. When we mix flour, salt and water, we make bread dough. But when this dough is stamped with the holy seal, it becomes a Prospero. After baking, we slow down the cooling by keeping the Prospero covered and wrapped. This is to prevent the crust from becoming brittle or developing cracks. Once you've mastered 1 or 2 Prospero, have a go at making more. They freeze well, and many churches have several divine liturgies each week. Through the prayers of our holy Prospero baking Saints Spiridon and Nicodemus, and our most holy Theotokos, may your Prospero baking efforts be blessed. For a more comprehensive coverage of everything to do with Prospero, both sourdough leavened as well as yeast risen, like the ones in this video, visit prospero.com. Thank you.